On January 13th, 2012, a massive white liner, as long as 3 football fields, lay on its side beside the rocky shore of a small Italian island. Thousands of people were swimming and climbing down ropes to safety. 32 of them never saw the morning. And the ship, which just the day before had been worth $500 million and carried thousands of tourists across the Mediterranean, had turned into a rusting skeleton the size of a skyscraper lying on its side. But this video isn't about the disaster itself. Dozens of documentaries have already been made about it, including a recent Netflix project. This video is about what happened after. How do you lift a 114,000-ton structure off the seabed after it has spent years grinding into the rocks? Where does a ship go when it officially no longer exists? And what ultimately happened to the person who was at the helm that night? Settle in. This is the story of the largest maritime salvage operation in human history, one that ended up costing more than building the liner itself. To understand the scale of what lay ahead, we need to spend a minute recalling how it all began. The Costa Concordia was a cruise liner belonging to Costa Concordia, part of the American Carnival Corporation. The ship was built at the Fincantieri shipyard and entered service in 2006. Its dimensions were staggering, over 290 meters long, with capacity for nearly 3,800 passengers and 1,100 crew members. On the evening of January 13th, 2012, the liner left the Italian port of Civitavecchia on another week-long cruise through the western Mediterranean. More than 4,000 people were on board. Captain Francesco Schettino decided to deviate from the ship's programmed route to perform a so-called salute, a traditional maritime maneuver in which a ship passes as close as possible to an island's shoreline, greeting the local residents with its lights and horn. The maneuver went catastrophically wrong. The liner struck an underwater rock near the island of Giglio, tearing a gash in the hull more than 50 meters long. Water rushed rapidly into the compartments. The ship lost power, and it began to list. Eventually, the massive vessel capsized onto its side and became lodged right at the shoreline, half submerged in the water. The evacuation was chaotic and delayed, and the captain himself, according to the investigation, left the ship before the passenger evacuation had been completed, an act that would later earn him the nickname, the Coward Captain. 32 people died. This is usually where the story people tell ends. But for the island of Giglio, for the Italian government, and for engineers around the world, the real work was only just beginning. Picture this. Beside a tiny island with a population of under 1,000 people lay a hull weighing more than 114,000 tons, heavier than 30 Eiffel Towers combined. The ship was partially submerged, resting on a rocky outcrop right at the entrance to the harbor, and inside it were thousands of tons of fuel, chemicals, decomposing food, and passengers' personal belongings. The first task wasn't to lift the ship, it was to prevent an environmental catastrophe. Throughout the early months of 2012, diving teams worked to pump out the diesel fuel from the sunken liner, more than 2,000 tons of it. This was a delicate operation. Any mistake could have caused an oil spill in the marine sanctuary that surrounds the island of Giglio. At the same time, debates raged over what to do with the hull itself. Different options were considered: cutting the ship apart on-site and hauling it away piece by piece, or raising the vessel whole and towing it away. The second option was technically far more complex, but far safer for the surrounding marine sanctuary. In the end, that was the option chosen. The salvage contract went to a consortium made up of the American company Titan Salvage and the Italian company Micopri. Preparations began for an operation that would later be called the largest and most complex maritime salvage in the history of shipping. The core problem was that the ship was lying on its side on an uneven, rocky seabed, partly resting on two rocky outcrops. If engineers had simply tried to lift it, the hull could have snapped in half under its own weight or slid into deeper water, from which raising it would have been all but impossible. Engineers devised a plan known as parbuckling, a technique sailors have used for centuries to right small capsized boats, but here applied at a scale no one had ever dared attempt on an object this size. First, an artificial underwater platform was built on the seabed beneath the submerged side of the ship, essentially a new patch of seafloor made of concrete supports strong enough to bear the ship's weight. This alone took months of underwater construction work. Next, massive steel platforms, flotation caissons, were attached to the raised side of the hull, above the waterline, to act as counterweights. Using a system of enormous cables, winches, and these counterweight caissons, engineers began slowly rotating the hull upright, just centimeters at a time. In September 2013, after months of preparation, the actual righting operation began. It lasted nearly 19 straight hours and involved about 500 specialists. It became one of the most tense scenes in modern engineering history. The entire world watched the live broadcast as the multi-thousand-ton hull was inched, millimeter by millimeter, up off its rocky resting place. The operation was a success. For the first time in more than a year and 8 months, the liner was once again upright. But this was only an intermediate stage. The ship was still resting on the underwater platform and still needed to be raised to the surface and made buoyant again. After the righting operation, even more empty steel boxes, called sponsons, were welded onto both sides of the hull. In total, about 30 of them were installed. These structures were designed to act as giant flotation devices. In the spring and summer of 2014, compressed air began to be pumped into these sponsons. Gradually, as the air displaced the water inside them, the sponsons filled up and lifted the liner's hull off the seabed. It was a genuine moment of rebirth. A ship that had sat motionless for 2 years was floating under its own buoyancy again, however battered and ruined it looked. Once the hull had risen high enough to move safely through the water, the time came for its final voyage, in July 2014, more than 2.5 years after the disaster. Tugboats began towing what remained of the Costa Concordia toward the port of Genoa, roughly 200 nautical miles from the island of Giglio. Genoa was chosen over the closer port of Piombino, which would first have needed to be dredged, and the weather window for safely towing such a fragile hull was limited. The voyage took about 4 days. The environmental organization Greenpeace expressed concern that the worn-out hull might leave a trail of toxic substances in the Mediterranean, but the tow proceeded without any serious incidents. On July 27, 2014, the battered hull finally arrived at the port of Voyage near Genoa. The event was broadcast live, and Italy's then Prime Minister, Matteo Renzi, flew in for the occasion, calling the operation's completion a restoration of national pride after a tragedy many had seen as a national humiliation. The ship was secured to the dock with 15 mooring lines. And so ended what was, by most accounts, the most expensive and complex maritime salvage operation in history, with some estimates putting the total cost of the entire salvage at over €1 billion. Arriving in Genoa didn't mark the end of the work. It was only the beginning of an equally massive new phase: dismantling. The demolition project was handed to a consortium made up of the Italian engineering firm Sapim, holding a 51% stake, and the Genoa-based San Giorgio del Porto, 49%. The entire process was expected to take around 2 years and cost roughly €100 million. The work was broken into several phases. First, everything that wasn't part of the ship's metal structure had to be removed. Furniture, equipment, personal belongings, and food waste that had been sitting in the holds for years. By some estimates, this first phase alone required removing 8,000 to 10,000 tons of material. Between 100 and 250 people were working on the project at any given time. The hull was then moved to a specialized dock, where deck-by-deck dismantling began from the top down. Much like taking apart a multi-story building floor by floor, except instead of bricks, there were thousands of tons of steel. The final phase took place in a dry dock, where the hull was ultimately cut apart entirely. All interior fittings were removed, and the metal was prepared for recycling. During this work came a haunting discovery. In November 2014, after the ship had already arrived in Genoa, human remains were found in one of the compartments. Forensic testing confirmed they belonged to a waiter named Russell Rebello, the last person on the missing list whose fate had remained unknown for nearly 3 years. Only after this discovery did the official death toll from the disaster finally close at 32 names. Dismantling of the liner was officially completed in 2017, roughly 3 years after the ship's arrival in Genoa. By the project's end, the consortium reported that approximately 53,000 tons of material had been recycled. The steel was sent for remelting, and, in a strange twist of fate, some of the metal from what had once been a luxury liner may well have ended up in entirely mundane objects: new ships, construction materials, or even household appliances. Today, the Costa Concordia, as we remember it, simply no longer exists. Not a single intact piece of the hull remains. The liner has literally dissolved into scrap metal, the raw material for something new if you add up all the costs. The salvage operation, the towing, the dismantling, the lawsuits, the passenger compensation, the fines, the total, by various estimates, exceeded $2 billion. For comparison, building an entirely new liner of that class would have cost the company significantly less. Costa Concordia paid a fine of more than $1 million and reached out-of-court settlements with the vast majority of affected passengers. Its parent company, Carnival Corporation, opened a dedicated training center in the Netherlands in 2016 for its fleet's captains and command crews, a direct result of the disaster investigation's findings. More than that, the Costa Concordia disaster changed safety practices across the entire cruise industry. After 2012, the International Maritime Organization introduced what's known as the 100% muster drill rule. Passenger safety briefings must now take place no later than 24 hours after departure, rather than at any point during the voyage as had previously been allowed. This rule is often simply referred to as the Concordia Rule. Schettino wasn't the only person facing consequences. In the months after the disaster, prosecutors also targeted several other officers and company staff who had been on duty that night or involved in managing the crisis from shore. In July 2013, 5 defendants, including the ship's deputy captain, 2 bridge officers, the Indonesian helmsman who was at the wheel during the fatal maneuver, the head of cabin service, and Costa Concordier's onshore crisis coordinator, reached plea bargain agreements with prosecutors. In exchange for pleading guilty to charges of multiple manslaughter, negligence, and causing the shipwreck, they avoided a lengthy trial. Their sentences range from about 18 months to just under 3 years, with the longest term going to the company's crisis coordinator. Because Italian law suspends short sentences of this kind, most of the 5 never actually spent time behind bars, a detail that infuriated many victims' families, who felt the punishments didn't come close to matching the scale of the tragedy. Schettino, notably, was offered no such deal. Prosecutors insisted on trying him separately and pursuing the maximum possible sentence, describing him in court as reckless and negligent, while his own defense argued that he was being unfairly singled out as a scapegoat for a chain of failures that involved the whole bridge crew and the company's shore-based management. One moment from that night became almost as famous as the disaster itself. Recorded radio exchanges between Schettino and an officer from the Italian Coast Guard, who repeatedly ordered him to return to the still-listing ship to help coordinate the evacuation while hundreds of passengers remained on board. Schettino never went back. Those recordings were played publicly again and again during the trial and turned into a symbol of the disaster's most damning failure. The moment when the person in command chose the shore over the ship. More than a decade later, the Costa Concordia still hasn't faded from public memory. If anything, interest in the story has only grown. The wreck has been the subject of numerous documentaries over the years, from early made-for-TV specials released just months after the sinking to more recent, deeply researched productions. In the summer of 2026, a new Netflix documentary revisited the disaster with previously unseen footage and fresh interviews with survivors, reigniting public interest in the case and prompting many people to ask, once again, what ultimately became of the ship and the man who commanded it. Some physical fragments of the Costa Concordia did escape the scrapyard. Before demolition began, certain items, lifeboats, furnishings, ship's fittings, even the massive ship's bell, were removed, cataloged, and in some cases preserved or donated, rather than melted down with the rest of the hull. A few of these artifacts have found their way into maritime museums and memorial displays, giving visitors a tangible link to a ship that otherwise no longer exists in any physical form. On the island of Giglio itself, informal memorials have sprung up over the years to honor the 32 people who died. For the roughly 800 residents who watched the disaster unfold from their own doorsteps, and who later lived alongside the wreck for more than 2 years, the anniversary of January 13th remains a solemn date, marked quietly each year rather than turned into a tourist spectacle. There's a separate story here, the fate of the man Italian media dubbed the coward captain. Francesco Schettino stood trial on charges of causing the shipwreck, multiple counts of manslaughter through negligence, and abandoning the ship before the passenger evacuation was complete. The trial lasted more than a year and a half and drew enormous media attention. Recordings were played in court of Schettino's conversations with the Italian Coast Guard, in which an officer ordered him to return to the ship, orders he did not follow. In February 2015, the court found him guilty on all major counts and sentenced him to 16 years in prison. Schettino appealed the verdict for several years, but in May 2017 Italy's highest court finally upheld the sentence. That same day, the former captain voluntarily reported to Rebibbia prison in Rome, where he remains to this day. Over the following years, Schettino repeatedly sought to have his conditions eased, in particular, the right to so-called semi-liberty, which would allow an inmate to leave prison during the day for work. His most recent such petition was filed in early 2025, but he withdrew it in April of that year, officially because he had been unable to secure a suitable work placement, a required condition of the program. Victims' families and survivors reacted to the news with mixed feelings. Many consider any softening of his sentence unjust given the scale of the tragedy. As of now, Schettino has already served about 10 years of his sentence and, barring early release, is due to be freed around 2033. That we shouldn't forget the island of Giglio itself, the small community that spent 2 years living side by side with a giant, rusting ship right at the entrance to its own harbor. The presence of salvage crews, vessels, and this enormous project brought the island both inconveniences and unexpected economic benefits. Hundreds of engineers and workers who lived and ate on the island for months temporarily boosted the local economy. But for Giglio's fishing and tourism community, the years spent with the wreck sitting just offshore remain a traumatic memory. Locals are still reluctant to talk about that night. The marine sanctuary surrounding the island, according to environmental assessments, ultimately recovered without major long-term damage to the ecosystem, thanks precisely to the careful, painstaking fuel pumping operation and the cautious raising of the hull, rather than any attempt to simply cut the ship apart on dash site. So, what ultimately happened to the Costa Concordia? A ship that spent 2 years lying on its side beside an Italian island was raised in an unprecedented feat of engineering, towed 200 miles to Genoa, and completely dismantled for scrap. Today, not a single intact piece of what was once a luxury liner remains. Only remelted steel, now scattered who knows where inside entirely different structures. The man who was at the helm that night is still behind bars and won't walk free for several more years. And the story of the Costa Concordia has permanently earned its place in maritime safety textbooks, a reminder of how one reckless decision and the equally remarkable engineering response to its consequences can reshape an entire industry. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel. There are many more What Happened To stories on the way. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.